And now I'd like to turn it over to our panel discussion. We have three panelists with us today. And I'd like to ask our panelists if they could kindly turn on their cameras, and we'll move over to that segment of the webinar. We have with us Karen Holm Olsen, Senior Researcher at UNEP DTU Partnership, Justin Goodwin, Director at Aether, and Mark Broomfield, a Technical Director at Ricardo Energy and Environment. And what I'd like to do is start with a question to Dr. Olsen. And Dr. Olsen, Karen, my question for you is, we saw especially at the recent negotiations in Glasgow that there's been some progress in terms of assessing the sustainable development impacts of different climate actions. I'm wondering if you could just give us some thoughts on how the presentations today can contribute to those discussions, and recognizing that we're dealing with air pollution, a little bit of water pollution, but some of your expertise is on a broader range of impacts. So Karen, I'd like to hear your response to that question.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks also to the presenters for the very rich, in-depth presentations of the tools and methodologies on assessing co-benefits. A little bit of introduction on my background is that it's since I did my PhD starting in 2002, so nearly for 20 years, I've been looking at the interlinkages between climate and sustainable development at the project level in context of first the Kyoto Protocol, now the Paris Agreement. And for many years, it was, I would have to say, a bit of a frustration that in spite of the objective of the Clean Development Mechanism, which had two objectives: to contribute to emission reductions cost efficiently and sustainable development, the sustainable development objective was never prioritized and priced. So the co-benefits, in spite of being in the objectives of the Clean Development Mechanism, it was never really operationalized at the same level as pricing the GHG emissions, which was at the basis of the market mechanisms. And now that I hear all the presentations today focusing on air quality and health, I think what comes to my mind as the key linkages between all this great work and what is now going on in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where I'm happy to say that we have a much better text in the Paris Agreement and Article 6 than we did in the past. So the same objective, but now we have text provisions to promote sustainable development that are, in my opinion, more robust, which is what I presented in the first webinar. But I think some of the sort of issues the discussions that are both we hear today and that are relevant for the Paris Agreement context are issues of open access to data. We hear that synergies in assessing emissions, inventories, both for air quality and for emission reductions is important. This is both at the city level, at the national level, and the project level. So it's again, it comes out so clearly from these presentations that integrated approaches, assessing both at the same time, not just single objectives, but multiple objectives being pursued in policies and actions, has opportunities for cost efficiency and achieving multiple objectives at the same time. But it does require, well, the tools, and I think in particular is what I would like to stress, open access to data, because it is, and that was also always the concern in the CDM, that it comes at a cost. If you want to assess not only one impact like emission reductions, GHG, but so many other impacts for sustainable development, what does that cost? So there are concerns about cost. So I think open access to data and synergies in reporting is super important. I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Karen. I think underlying these costs of data, transaction costs, and then the open access to data drive down those costs is really essential. And that comes through clearly in your work and all of the presentations we've heard today. That's really a useful insight, and also underlining the robustness of some of the provisions in the Paris Agreement and the new Article 6 rulebook, I think, is also quite useful. Now I'd like to turn it over to our colleague, Justin Goodwin from Aether. And Justin, my question for you is a little bit about how you think the presentations today could contribute to discussions on MRV, measurable, reportable, and verifiable systems, and transparency framework that's being discussed under the climate agreement. I understand you've also done work, of course, on air pollution and climate change and emission inventory. So some of that is quite familiar to you, but can you try to connect it a little bit into some of the discussions on MRV and the transparency framework?
Yes, thank you, Eric, and hi everybody. It's a great pleasure to be talking to all these interested people and to have had a chance to listen to these presentations. So my background really comes from developing, designing the UK's integrated air pollutant greenhouse gas inventory, and then the pathways of using that inventory data to inform decision makers, policy makers, feed into models, and of course for reporting. And so that's been the backdrop of my career, really, has been involved in, I suppose, as a techie person, thinking we could do more with this inventory data. We could accelerate decision making with better use of this combined view of air pollutant greenhouse gases. Linking that to the SDs, and before I just go into the Paris Agreement and the enhanced transparency framework, thinking about the sustainable development goals, we also find with this work, which looks at statistics, looks at emission factors, looks at this sort of impact weighting of an activity, that discipline is actually pretty close to discipline that you need to look at other sustainable development issues, particularly water pollution, waste, plastics, all these other issues that are coming up. So there's a discipline here that we should nurture and improve to inform decision makers with evidence-based information. So these presentations today are really reassuring to see the lengths that we've gone to and what we've managed to achieve to mash this data together to come up with answers to some super complex questions. And I'm very proud to be part of that fraternity, really, that's doing it, even though I'm sort of just more of a data supplier to this co-benefit analysis and the work that's been done in GAINS. So to link that to the Paris Agreement and the MRV work, it's increasingly evident that decision makers need support to understand this full range of impacts of those decisions, whether you're building roads, designing ships, building houses, working on energy systems. There's a massive amount of conflicting information or biased information coming to decision makers, and they often have to make these decisions in quite short time frames. So it's incredibly important to have a well-sustained, well-structured MRV system. And what I mean by an MRV system is the combination of expertise, these teams, virtual teams of experts working pretty much full time on gathering data, processing data, and the data flow. And this is what the Paris Agreement MRV system reporting is about. The Paris Agreement can only go so far as to say what could or should be reported to provide transparency in order for us to globally make good decisions. But actually what it's trying to encourage is the increased engagement of decision makers with new and additional data that is important to make sure that the next 20 years of development don't end us in desperate trouble. So the co-benefits analysis is really where we start to say we can't look at climate in a silo. We can't design policies to burn wood because there are all these other negative impacts of burning wood. So this analysis, and particularly the analysis between greenhouse gases and air pollutants, which are pollutants emitted into a very, very dynamic environment, into the atmosphere. Looking at this is one of the highest priorities of understanding sustainable development. Coming back to the presentations, again, we've seen where these elements are being applied. We've seen the technical detail, the bewildering detail, really, that goes into some of this analysis. My parting message is to say, we need to make sure that the decision makers, i.e. our politicians, who aren't necessarily scientists, and our public, who aren't necessarily scientists, can quickly make decisions around this data. They trust the data, it's easy for them to understand, and they can make informed investment decisions, whether that's a personal pension or whether that is building a power station. They can make those decisions quickly and with good reassurance that those decisions are based on the best evidence. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Justin. I really like some of the, not only the sort of intuition behind your response, but some of the language in terms of mashing up some of the data, and then, you know, thinking a little bit more broadly about, you know, how do we move from GHG emission inventories to assessing these SD impacts, and then connecting that, of course, to a broader trend where we see more and more emphasis on evidence-based decision making, but not just relying upon the evidence, but also using that evidence to sort of change the process of how we make decisions. I think this is really useful. And it draws nicely into our next panelist. And we also have with us Dr. Mark Broomfield, who is, if I'm not mistaken, also working with the ADB on a consulting project. But Mark has extensive experience working in the UK, and I wanted to ask Mark about his experience in the UK and delivering climate benefits alongside air quality improvements. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to the speakers today. It's been a really interesting morning for us. So yeah, as Eric said, I'm from the UK, and we in the UK have been working to improve air quality since about 1954. Although I wasn't personally involved then. And in fact, the first laws to improve air pollution here were passed more than 700 years ago. But more recently, we have started to look for win-wins by which we can improve both air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Many city authorities in the UK have taken the step of declaring a climate emergency, which mandates action to deal with climate, and also declaring their intention to move towards net zero carbon status. So these initiatives do align well with strategies to improve air quality, but in my experience, so far, they're not closely linked to optimize the co-benefits. I think as Justin just said, we could do better. So as a result, our experience of delivering climate and air quality benefits is mixed and not always successful. But I would just like to point to some recent experiences in London around transportation emissions, and both Dang and Zig have highlighted in particular the importance of transport solutions in the Asian region, and equally important for us here in the UK. So the London ultra low emission zone was expanded last year to cover about 25% of the city, or about 4 million people. And that sets minimum emission standards for cars and vans. And there's an even larger LEZ, low emission zone, that sets emission standards for trucks and buses. And as a result, we expect transportation emissions of NOx to reduce by about 30% in 2021 compared to 2019, which is fine. That's what you'd expect from an initiative like that. But there's also expected to be a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions from cars and vans in London, which perhaps you wouldn't expect. And this reduction in CO2 results from people moving away from cars to other forms of transport, and also investing in newer and more efficient vehicles. And the compliance level for the low emission zone has also doubled between 2017, when a low emission zone was first introduced, to 2021, even with the much tighter controls that are now in place. So yeah, thinking about what does this experience show, I think it illustrates firstly that investing in new, cleaner technologies will often improve CO2 emissions alongside that. Policies that support or enable new pollution control equipment or new vehicles, for example, typically deliver climate benefits alongside air pollution benefits. Similarly, investments in more energy efficient technologies also often deliver air quality benefits. But I think at the moment that happens quite ad hoc. We don't have that kind of systematic analysis that we've been hearing about this morning. Secondly, and perhaps related to that, implementation of such measures requires care, and new technology often needs a support network to ensure that it works in practice. And in the case of the London ultra low emission zone, monitoring and enforcement systems are complemented by good quality alternatives to road transport. And then thirdly, as well as benefits, there can be unexpected downsides. For example, provision of sufficient generating capacity to meet peak electricity demand in our cities is a growing problem. And we've ended up in a situation where we sometimes are using diesel-fired generators during short periods to meet the peak demand. And although that's, I guess, limited in extent, it's bad for both air pollution and climate. And finally, I think that the acceptance of the large-scale ultra-low emission zone and the much higher levels of compliance show that it's an idea whose time has come, this bringing together of climate and air pollution concerns. There's widespread understanding that we need to and we can reduce both air pollution and carbon emissions. Newspapers and social media are talking about both climate and air quality and taking both matters seriously. And the use of tools such as those we've heard about today will grow, not just in the UK, but throughout the world. And finally, I was just thinking that 5 years ago, many men my age in our 50s would spend a long time sitting in the pub or the bar talking about performance cars and their next car. But today we're talking about electric cars. And I think, Eric, that's a more interesting subject and definitely a win-win. So yeah, that's my kind of feedback on experience in the UK. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for taking us on this tour that starts in 1954 and brings us all the way up to electric vehicles. I think that underscores the importance of if we want to achieve many of these multiple benefits, we need transitions and transformations in different types of systems. And I think what we've seen today is that in order for transformation to happen, we need to work across multiple sectors, multiple stakeholders, and also multiple scales from project all the way up to policy, all the way up to some of the international agreements themselves. And I think that's a very useful segue itself into the end of our webinar for today, but also to underline that this is part of a webinar series. And we'll be having some follow-up webinars on February 3rd and February 24th with a different panel of speakers, but that hopefully build collectively on some of the insights that we've heard in the air pollution case. And we'll be sending out announcements to all of you who registered about those webinars. So we look forward to seeing you again there. And I believe that some of you might have questions. Do feel free to contact me in the email address that I've left, I think, already once in the box, the chat box, or others who leave their email address. I can also connect you to people that have spoken today. It's no problem at all. Thank you so much, and we do appreciate your participation and active listening. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.